It's a staple part of most of our meals. It's a staple part of most of our diets. And that's a lot of the milk, a lot of the dairy products that we like to consume with breakfast, with lunch, with dinner. We've talked about this in the past based off of a lot of the hoopla that came out with the discussion in December 2023 about whole milk and the need to have whole milk in school lunches. But it's a story that we need to revisit. It's a story we need to come back to because we have this new report, because we have this misapplication, this misunderstanding about what this is, this food pyramid idea, and the fact that we don't actually use the food pyramid anymore. We now use the healthy plate or the my plate idea in terms of breaking down our foods into the various food groups. But we have a whole host of new ideas, new agendas coming forward, including the fact that we may need to revisit some of the ideas that we happen to have, which leads to misconceptions, and misinformation about dairy products that we have to address. Things like whole milk, organic milk, raw milk. What should we know? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning! The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So what's the debate? What is the discussion that's going on? What is the ideas around this need to have whole milk, particularly this idea that we have to reinstitute whole milk into the diet for children? We need to somehow allow for greater amounts of whole milk being consumed within adult diets. It's really looking at what is the difference that we see in terms of nutritional value in between whole milk, 2% milk, 1% milk, skim milk. How is that related to some of the plant-based milks, if we want to call them milks, that we have there? How does it relate to the idea about raw milk and the fact that there's now this push to institute greater consumption or a greater availability of raw milk in terms of what's available for normal consumption? When we start looking at this idea about the various types of milks that are out there, we have to look at what is the nutritional value that comes into play. Yes, there's a lot of political discussions going on. Yes, there's a lot of talking heads going on. But it's not about the talking heads. It's not about the political agenda. It's about what is the nutritional value that these various types of beverages happen to have for us. And so, what is it about the nutrients that we have to look at? Remember, it's not about calories. It's about the nutrients and the nutrients that we get from the various substances that we're going to have within our diet, where we're going to be combating this idea that there's good foods and bad foods, good intakes and bad intakes. But what we have to remember is that we're trying to balance our nutrient intake with our nutrient utilization based off of all of the parameters that we've been talking about in terms of how many grams of carbohydrates we should have in a day, how many grams of protein we should have in a day, how many grams of lipids we should have in a day. Within that, we have to look at what are the various types of milks that we might be able to get, what are the various types of butters we might be able to get, what are the various types of creams we might be able to get. When we start looking at this, let's break it down. Once again, the USDA gave us these wonderful charts almost about 3 or 4 years ago that look at it in terms of the breakdown. So this is based off of a per serving in terms of the raw components. We'll get to the individual nutrients here in a second here. So what is the big difference in terms of what we get in terms of the whole milk, the 2% milk, the 1% milk, and the skim milk? What's the difference that we might get with the alternative milks we might have, in particular the alternative mammal milks, goat, sheep, and buffalo here in terms of what the USDA has provided to us? Notice, we don't see big, huge differences in total amount of water, total amount of energy, total amount of carbohydrates. And when we're talking about those carbohydrates, we're really looking at the amount of lactose that is there. There may be some additional sugars within there, but it's predominantly looking at lactose in terms of bovine or cow milk versus the other milks that are there. The big difference that we start seeing is we start looking at how much fat is provided to us. And the amount of fat in whole milk, which is 3.25% milk versus the 2% reduced versus the 1% versus the skim. Even with skim, there's still some fat there. It's just less than a gram per serving. But the big difference we see is with that fat. Keep that in mind because that's where a lot of the discussion is going to come into play in terms of this idea about whole milk being good versus whole milk being bad. Once again, put quotes around good and bad because good and bad is the indication of choices that are being made. And so what is this that we're looking at in terms of the actual breakdown of the nutrients? Do we actually see large differences in nutrient loads? Now, notice there's a lot more vitamin A that we get in the reduced fat milks. There's not much difference in any of the other vitamins that we happen to have there. There's a little bit higher amounts of vitamin D that's there. Once again, not much difference that we see in terms of any of the electrolytes, any of the ions that we have within any of this stuff. There is very little difference in terms of lactose concentrations. We start seeing a little bit of difference in terms of some of the saturated fats on the whole milk side versus the lower reduced fat milk sides. But once again, it's not that big of a difference in terms of the total amounts of grams if we look at it in terms of how much gram we should have per day. We start looking at the protein breakdowns. Once again, not huge differences in terms of the essential amino acids that we need, as well as all of the other amino acids, whether they're essential or non-essential. We don't get much differences in terms of the branched chain amino acids. Now notice there is a caveat here in terms of stuff that gets added into. Why do we get higher amounts of vitamin A? Why do we get higher amounts of vitamin D in the reduced fat milks? Because they get fortified. That is one of the things we see in terms of the difference between the lower fat and the full fat in terms of the milk. Now, what about when we start breaking down based off of 100-gram servings? Once again, not huge differences. We do not see big differences. Once again, we do see a difference with the vitamin A, but once again, that's because it's being fortified. We see a small difference in terms of vitamin D, but once again, that's because it's being fortified. That fortification is taking place because we have to reintroduce some of the vitamins that are being extracted during the process where we're removing the fats, particularly with those fat-soluble vitamins. Notice, not huge differences, even within the fatty acids, even within the fats. There's not a huge difference that we see. Yes, the whole fat is going to be slightly higher than the others, the 1% to 2%. It's going to be on par or in line with some of the sheep, some of the buffalo, some of the goat milk that we see in terms of the fats. Proteins, once again, the amino acids, there's very little difference that we see in terms of the amino acid compositions within the various types of fats. And we obtain all of those branched chain amino acids that we need in terms of the diet. What about the idea about organic versus the traditional? And this is where we actually can look at some of the studies here. Organic, significantly more lactose in organic relative to conventional, but once again, it's still not that much more. We get significantly less fat in organic milk versus the conventional milk. We get slightly less or significantly less protein in organic versus the conventional. But once again, these percentages are not drastically large, even though it's indicated as being significant in the studies. The amount difference that's there, even though significant, is not an effective significance, which means we look at the effect size differences. There's not any way of favoring one side or the other in this review of the various types of milk and that takes us to raw milk. And that's the big push within the MAHA community, big push that has been made by the HHS secretary, along with this idea about making sure that people are consuming whole milk, even though whole milk doesn't seem to have any actual nutritional benefits that we don't get from the other fat milks. But one of the things that gets pushed here is raw milk. And one of the things that a lot of the proponents for raw milk is that it's somehow better for the child, better for the adult who's going to drink raw milk because it's quote unquote raw. It's not been pasteurized. Pasteurization is a method that is used in order to prevent pathogen transference. It's going to make the milk safe to consume. It does not change any of the nutritional values. It does not change any of the nutrients within the milk based off of pasteurization. And so when we start looking at this idea about pasteurization and this idea that raw milk is somehow better for us, what we have to do is we have to look at what's the evidence for it. Do we actually have evidence to support this contention that raw milk is better for us? Well, the FDA is giving us this nice website. This website is basically taking us through and say, okay, is it safe or is it not safe to consume raw milk? What is the evidence that we have in terms of nutritional values to consuming raw milk? Raw milk is not nutritionally superior to pasteurized milk. We have numerous studies that have indicated that pasteurization has very, very little impact on the nutritional quality of milk. There is no way that pasteurization is going to somehow increase lactose concentration. There is no way that not pasteurizing is going to somehow keep lactose concentration low. Raw milk does not cure lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance is due to the fact that I stopped producing an enzyme lactase, and that lactase usually stops being produced around the age of 5. And if I am someone who has the genes to continue to produce lactase after the age of 5, I will continue to be able to digest lactose. If I have the gene that stops me from producing lactase after the age of 5, I will become lactose intolerant. There is no difference in the concentration of lactose between raw milk and pasteurized milk. Yes, there may be concentration differences in between cow milk and other animal milk, but there is no difference that we see in the pasteurization versus the non-pasteurization. So raw milk does not cure lactose intolerant. There is no endogenous lactase in milk. There is no lactase that we see in terms of the enzymes found within milk. There are some enzymes that we see in human breast milk, but it's not lactose. It's not lactase. It is other enzymes that are necessary in order to break down proteins and break down lipids. There is no additional proteases, no additional lipases in raw milk versus what we see in the pasteurized milk. Proteases and lipases are enzymes that are going to break down proteins, break down lipids, but we do not see differences in between the concentrations of proteases and the concentration of lipases in the raw milk versus in the pasteurized milk. In human breast milk, there are a increase of proteases, increase of lipases that's necessary, particularly for very young infants, in terms of being able to digest lipids, be able to digest proteins within human breast milk. But we do not see those concentrations in cow milk. Raw milk is not some sort of immune superfood. It's not going to build immunity. It's not going to assist with building immunity. And it can become particularly unsafe for children due to exposure of bacteria in the raw milk that we do not see in the pasteurized milk, because the pasteurized milk will kill those unsafe bacteria. There are no immunoglobulins in raw milk that is different than the immunoglobulins that we see in pasteurized milk, and the concentration is excessively low. The low concentrations of immunoglobulins have no physiological effect on humans. Yes, we do see immunoglobulins in human breast milk. It's one of the reasons why I want to encourage breastfeeding for infants, so that we get immunoglobulin transfer, so we start to have the acquisition of passive acquired immunity, very similar to vaccinations. You can think of breastfeeding as the initiation of vaccinations for the infant. If we cannot breastfeed, if we are formula feeding, that's where we need to make sure we have skin to skin contact, so we get the transference of the immunoglobulins, so we get transference of other things from the mother's skin or even from the father's skin onto the infant, into the infant, so that we can start to develop that passive acquired immunity. Raw milk does not contain antimicrobial peptides, antimicrobial proteins. One of the ones that a lot of the raw milk advocates like to discuss is niacin. Niacin is not going to be there in the raw milk. There's no evidence to support niacin being in high concentrations in raw milk. And even if it is, it's only going to be effective against a couple of strains of Lactococcus bacterium, not against a lot of the other strains of bacterium. And even then, it's not going to allow for raw milk to become safe. It does not contain natural antimicrobial compounds or components to it that automatically makes the milk safe. It does not contain lactoferrin, lactoperoxidase, lysosomes, or xanthine oxidase to a significant amount that would allow us to support the claim that there's these endogenous antimicrobial components that somehow make raw milk safe, that somehow raw milk is killing the pathogens that's going to somehow ensure that it's safe for human consumption. If we actually look at the evidence that's out there, there is a number of bacterial outbreaks that have been linked with consuming raw milk. Most of them deal with Listeria or E. coli, but you can also get salmonella issues along with the E. coli and along with the Listeria. So much so that we usually do not allow for raw milk to be served to children, even though we might see it there. So we don't see big differences in terms of the cow milk based off of the fat percentages. We do not see big differences in terms of organic versus conventional. There's no reason to consume the raw milk. There is no health benefit from raw milk. But what about the other milk beverages? What about the plant-based beverages? Well, if we start looking at the breakdown of stuff, we start looking at the breakdown of proteins. We do not see huge differences in protein concentrations in between the various types of plant-based milk drinks, almond drinks, cashew drinks. We do not see big differences in between the oat and the hemp and the oat and the coconut drink. We start seeing big differences when we start comparing those plant-based drinks to the soy drinks and the cow's milk. Soy milk and cow's milk are closer in concentration to each other in terms of the proteins, which is why if we are going to follow a plant-based diet, we want to make sure that we're consuming soy in the diet in order to make sure that we have high amounts of protein. It's not the only source of protein. The problem with a lot of these plant-based beverages, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes here when we revisit some of the previous conversation, is that we have to worry about some of the phytosterols that are there and the impact the phytosterols might have. In terms of the fat percentages, those plant-based are going to have lower concentrations of total fat. They're going to have a slightly better fat skew in terms of omega-6 and omega-3s than what we see within the cow milk. We have lower total concentrations of fat in terms of grams per kilogram that we see in terms of what's there. Once again, looking at that ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, we have to have a bit of concern if we start looking at it in terms of one of the advocacies that is made in terms of wanting to avoid some of these products is that it skews the omega-6s and the omega-3s. But if I am going to be consuming a plant-based beverage, as long as I am increasing my omega-3 fatty acids from other sources, I should be perfectly fine in terms of that ratio. Because once again, we want to make sure that our ratio does not get skewed higher into the omega-6s relative to the omega-3s based off of what we use omega-6s and omega-3s for, where we want to be in the neighborhood of about 4-to-1 to 6-to-1 in terms of total ratio in the day. In terms of carbohydrates, the cow's milk and the rice milk are going to be the highest that we see in terms of the carbohydrates. Now, this carbohydrate idea is kind of skewed here because, yes, we're looking at total carbohydrates, but the types of carbohydrates are going to be slightly different. In cow's milk, in mammal milk, it's going to be predominantly that carbohydrate level is going to be predominantly lactose. In the other ones is going to be predominantly sucrose. And because we get that swing towards sucrose, because we get that swing towards starch in terms of the amount of glucose, for people who have to worry about glucose load, it may be at a disadvantage for them to be consuming the plant-based beverages in terms of the total carbohydrate load. If we start looking at it in terms of the concentrations of those carbohydrates, once again, look at the swing that we get towards sucrose, towards glucose, towards fructose, relative towards lactose. And once again, if I am lactose intolerant, I want to avoid the cow's milk and consume the other beverages that are there. Where the other beverages are going to be ranging from the lowest level of sugar within them, being that, once again, looking at the pure numbers here, the simple sugar, the sucrose sugar, which is usually that added sugar that we look at in terms of the carbohydrate load, that almond milk is going to have that lowest level of total amount of sugar that we see within there. Now, if we start looking at that oat drink, if we start looking at that rice beverage, if we start looking at that cashew beverage, yes, the sucrose levels tend to be low, but the starch levels tend to be high, which is why for some of those beverages, they tend to taste sweeter, which is why a lot of people will prefer that oat or that rice milk versus the soy milk or versus the almond milk in terms of the added milk into the beverage, particularly if we're adding it to something that happens to be tart. What else might we have? Well, if we start looking at the various levels of calcium, the various levels of vitamins, we don't see huge changes, huge differences in terms of a lot of the numbers, in terms of what we are looking at. Yes, there are some that are going to provide us with greater amounts of iron, greater amounts of magnesium relative to other sources. But for what we're looking at in terms of the amounts that we're trying to consume in a day, we do not get huge differences in the concentration of the products in the plant-based beverages for calcium, for iron, for potassium, for phosphates, relative to what we might get for cow's milk. Yes, there are some differences, but the differences are not significant in terms of what we see there, given what we consume throughout the day. Now, if we start looking at some of the vitamins, yes, there are going to be some swings in terms of the amount of vitamin that we might get. And this is where some of the proponents in terms of that vitamin C number on the cow's milk, we'll talk about the raw milk having higher amounts of vitamin C, but it's not really that much higher than what we see in there. Same with some of the other B vitamins. We do not see large swings in terms of B vitamin differences, with the exception of niacin, where we will see higher amounts of niacin, higher amounts of folate in some of the plant-based beverages, in particular the almond and the soybean in terms of those values. But once again, it's still, if as long as we're consuming stuff within normal nutritional ranges, it seems to be where we're okay. Same with the amino acids. So there's not that big difference that we see in terms of the plant-based beverages versus the animal-based beverages based off of the nutrition load that's there. It may come down to whether or not I want to be exposed to other things that I might get in the plant beverages that I do not get in the animal beverages, stuff I get in the animal beverages that I don't want to get in the plant beverages, where I have to weigh what is my personal nutrition load, what is my personal nutrient balance based off of all of the health issues that I might have. But the other thing that comes into play here is this idea about the butters and what we might get in terms of butter composition and butter concentrations relative to what we might get in other values. And what we see is we see some differences in terms of total amounts of fat, total amounts of saturated fat in the butters versus the oleos, the margarines, with no real big difference whether it is clarified, the ghee, or whether it is the tallow, or whether it is just regular butter in terms of the differences that we see. The big difference that we see in between the margarines and the animal fats in terms of the making of the butter is the presence of the trans fats, the partially hydrogenated fats, where the margarines tend to have a slightly higher amounts of those trans fats, those partially hydrogenated fats, relative to the naturally occurring animal butters. The idea about the cholesterol issues and the need to watch how much butter, how much egg you consume based off of cholesterol, we know is not true based off of the science that we now have in terms of cholesterol and dietary cholesterol impacting circulating levels of cholesterol. Yes, we do have to worry about saturated fats, but even then, the amount of saturated fat that we're getting from milk, from butter, is insignificant relative to the total amount of saturated fat that we get from other sources or that we would have for a total day. There is some talk, if we start looking at the dietary guidelines that are laid out particularly for children, is that there's this idea, and it goes into why we eliminated the whole milk from the diet for the children in terms of whole milk at school. You can get about 10 to 15% for some children, depending upon size and age, from consuming whole milk at school. And this is where the debate comes into play in terms of how much saturated fat we should have in a day coming from milk products, coming from butter products, relative to what we should get from the rest of the diet. We have to be kind of careful in terms of how much saturated fat is there. Yes, it sounds like a lot, but in the totality, it's actually not that much in terms of saturated fat, particularly when we're looking at it in terms of the saturated fat coming from the percentage based off of calorie intake, as opposed to the amount based off of grams per pound or grams per kilogram of body mass in a day. So, what's the debate? Why is it that we're having this debate? Is it that there's dueling ideas? Or is it that we have more than just two ideas? Is it that we have all of these various ideas coming into play that are all talking over each other, all talking about each other, all talking to each other? It's not that. What's ended up happening is that we're getting this discussion not between each other, but within each other, where we are cloistering into our echo chambers and talking within our echo chambers about this nutritional idea. It's why we have this huge pushback against a lot of the initiatives within the MAHA, which is not really trying to make America healthy again. It's a whole sales pitch that we've been talking about for the last few months in terms of what it actually has to offer us. What is happening is that we are perpetuating a lot of myths. We are perpetuating a lot of misinformation, a lot of misconceptions because we are choosing not to listen to the science, because we are choosing to look at this in a nonsensical fashion. So, how can we make
Actually
sense of this?
is pushing for this whole milk thing in the first place. Do you know what the context is? Like why did she think that whole milk is such a superfood, which superfoods aren't real, but why does she think that whole milk is so godly that it needs to be pushed in this regimen for the schools? Why?
Uh, Political.
Political. Okay.
It's yeah, it's purely political, and I see Dalton smirk on the Zoom. Um,
Yep.
Yeah. Lo and behold, it comes down to political. It comes down to political, based off of 2010, 2011. I can't remember the exact date, but
Mhm.
uh, the former First Lady Michelle Obama had a big,
Yes.
huge push for healthy schools.
Right.
As you've heard on some of my soapboxing in the classrooms, some of the
Mhm.
stuff I agreed with, some of the stuff I disagreed with.
Right.
One of the things that they did, and it kind of goes into this poor nutrition literacy,
Mhm.
is they got rid of whole milk in
Right.
the guise of, okay, we're going to do 1%, 2% skim.
Yes.
And some of the research that came out, and there's a table in the scroll, in the other part of the YouTube video, that comes from the US Department of Agriculture. And it basically looks at, okay, what are the nutrient differences between skim milk, 1% milk, 2% milk, whole milk?
Mhm.
And if you actually look at it in terms of the nutrients, the nutritional breakdown, there's very little difference in between whole milk, 2% milk, 1% milk, or skim milk. Most of it goes into the not understanding what those percentages mean.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking at, okay, what's 1%, 2% whole milk, what we're talking about milk fat. We're not
Yeah.
talking about fat content, because the difference between them is minuscule in terms of the actual grammage of fat. But the labeling becomes, oh, fat is bad, was kind of the push that came out from the low fat diet trend,
Yeah.
the low fat fad diet,
Right.
that stemmed from some, it was a good research if you're looking at highly active people. It was bad research if you're looking at everybody else.
Oh, okay.
That basically looked at, okay, what nutrients do you need in high percentages versus what nutrients do you need in low percentages? And when you're very highly active, you need to have large amounts of carbohydrates, and you have large amounts of protein, and you don't need as much fat in terms of
Yes.
in terms of your macronutrient breakdown.
Right.
And then from that, a lot of meals ready to eat style meals got developed.
Hmm.
And the head researcher out of the University of Minnesota, I believe it was at the University of Minnesota, or he was at the Mayo Clinic, I can't remember which institute he was at, kept researching it. And he basically got on kind of pigeonholed himself or railroaded himself into one avenue of research that looked at uh, fat intake, in particular saturated fat intake,
Yeah.
and heart disease.
Okay.
And this is Ansel Keys is the researcher if you want to look up his work. And that led to this position that dietary fat is bad. Now, dietary fat by itself is not bad.
Hmm.
Do we need to be careful about sources of dietary fat? Yes. Do we need to be careful about the consumption of trans fats within the dietary
Oh,
fat?
yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But fat by itself, whether it's monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, or saturated fat,
Hmm.
has metabolic benefits to us.
Right.
Most of the heart disease issues that get associated with fat diet, particularly animal fat diet, which is where one of the avenues came in with the former positions that were taken by the White House in the mid to in from basically the Obama administration, looking at okay, let's reduce animal proteins and let's reduce animal fats and let's
Yeah.
increase fruits and vegetables, which is good, which is a good position. But it misses the point in terms of okay, what is actually nutritionally valid and what's nutritionally not valid. And so I know I'm kind of going a long way around to answer the question here, but the principal rationale that was given is that if we can get rid of whole milk from the schools, we can reduce some of the fat intake
Okay.
in the children. But at the same time, within the lower fat milks, there appears to be higher concentrations of several types of vitamins that can have benefit. The vitamin
Okay.
Bs,
Yeah.
there's slightly higher concentration of vitamin D in the
Okay.
lower fat milk than there is in the whole milk. Part of that has to do with the processing that takes place,
Right.
the chemical reactions that occur. Uh, but it's a concentration issue.
Hmm.
Some of it might be due to fortification that takes place in the the milk processing
Right.
that goes about, which leads into a whole other issue in terms of the non-pasteurized, quote unquote, raw
Yeah. Right.
issue. But the principal reason for the debate that was taking place at that point in time was to counterbalance the move that they saw as being political. And it wasn't political. There was very little politicalization in that move. It was a movement done under the guise that were trying to benefit the children, which is it was a good once again, the principle that they were working on was good.
Hmm.
We need to have schools that are pro health in their orientation. And so when does that happen? We start having this idea about having good foods and bad foods. This idea that we have some sort of benefit from eating just plants or drinking just plant-based beverages versus what we get from eating animals and drinking animal milk and consuming animal milk in our breakfast and our lunch and our dinners. And this whole idea comes into play. And so whether it's coming from a misconstrued uh, ideal about what is benefit for us, what is good for us, or this misapplication of this idea about this quote unquote broken food pyramid, which tends to be the hallmark of the argument being made by those who are purporting the need to have a reinstitution of whole milk within the diet, whole milk within the school system, without understanding that we've changed, we've adapted, we've updated based off of current understanding of dietary guidelines, current understanding of nutrition science, current understanding of health science, where we are no longer beholden to this outdated idea that fat is bad. It's one of those things that's been reinstituted and reconstituted over and over and over again since Ansel Keys first put this out and first got into the magazines. And we wrote about it in the Dogmatic Diet book. That fat is bad, that salt is bad. But when we start putting and labeling bad food versus good food, It leads to a misconception about what we should and shouldn't have in terms of diet. And what it does is it leads us to the present point here, where we allow for the misinformation, we allow for the disinformation to become the central tenet within public health discussion, within public health debate, that limits what we can advocate for based off of what is the scientific understanding, based off of what are we able to say is true versus what we think is true or what we want is true. And one of the big things we talked about this when we did our take on the MAHA report. The biggest problem with that MAHA report is that it was based off of what I want to be true, and by I, the person in charge of Health and Human Services, versus what is true. Yes, there is a place for whole milk in the diet. Yes, there's a place for 2% milk in the diet. Yes, there's a place for plant-based beverages in the diet. This is where we have to remember that we have to approach dietary restrictions and dietary guidelines as a holistic viewpoint, where it is not a this or that, but it is a this and that idea. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hopefully get a bit out of the conversation. If you like what we're putting out there, please make sure you give us that thumbs up. Make sure you've subscribed to follow us here on YouTube as well as on the podcast. Please make sure you've shared out with all your friends and family. If you have questions or comments, please make sure you leave it for us. We're more than happy to discuss things in greater detail and have further conversations in terms of the topics that we're presenting. That is the whole purpose of the education platform that we're trying to purport here. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us here on YouTube as well as on the podcast. Check out the written stuff in Substack as well as the quick takes on Instagram and Threads, and now on Bluesky.